The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry wasps, as Officer Karen Whitmore's latex gloves snapped against her wrists with the sharp crack of authority. She stared down at the elderly black man standing before her, his weathered hands clasped patiently behind his back, his eyes steady and calm, despite the chaos erupting around them. The Denver International Airport security checkpoint had ground to a halt, passengers craning their necks to witness what was becoming an increasingly volatile scene. I said, "Step back from the conveyor belt." Karen barked, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of rolling luggage and frustrated travelers. Her badge caught the harsh lighting, casting metallic reflections across her stern face. "Your identification doesn't look right to me." Judge Harold Preston, 73 years old and carrying 4 decades of judicial experience in his measured demeanor, remained motionless. His gray suit was impeccably pressed, his tie straight, his posture reflecting a lifetime of courtroom dignity. He had witnessed this dance before, had seen the way certain people looked at him when they thought his credentials couldn't possibly match his appearance. "Ma'am, I've presented my valid driver's license and boarding pass, just as requested," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being heard, without raising his volume. "I'm simply trying to catch my flight to Washington." The morning had started peacefully enough. Judge Preston had risen at 5:30, as was his custom, brewing his coffee in the small kitchen of his Denver apartment, where he'd been staying during a judicial conference. The National Judicial Ethics Committee meeting awaited him in the Capitol, a gathering where he would chair discussions on judicial conduct standards that would affect courts across the nation. His keynote address on equality in the justice system was tucked carefully in his briefcase, along with case files and constitutional law reviews that had occupied his thoughts for weeks. He had arrived at the airport 2 hours early, understanding the complexities of modern travel security. The check-in process had proceeded smoothly, the airline agent greeting him with professional courtesy. But now, standing in this sterile security area, with its antiseptic smell and constant electronic beeping, he found himself confronting a familiar adversary dressed in a TSA uniform. Karen Whitmore had been working airport security for 8 years, long enough to develop what she considered a keen eye for suspicious behavior. At 42, she prided herself on her vigilance, on her ability to spot potential threats that others might miss. She had received commendations for her thoroughness, though colleagues sometimes whispered about her selective interpretation of what constituted suspicious activity. "This ID looks suspicious to me," she announced loudly, holding Judge Preston's driver's license up to the light, as if examining currency for forgeries. "How do I know this is really you? You could be anybody." The absurdity of the statement hung in the air like smoke. Judge Preston's photograph clearly matched his appearance. His information was current, and the license bore all the standard security features of a valid Colorado identification. Yet Karen continued her performance, turning the plastic card over repeatedly, squinting at it with exaggerated suspicion. Behind them, the security line had grown longer, travelers shifting restlessly as their patience wore thin. A businessman in an expensive suit checked his watch repeatedly, his face flushing with frustration. A young mother bounced her crying baby, shooting concerned glances toward the unfolding drama. An elderly couple whispered to each other in Spanish, their eyes reflecting a recognition that came from their own experiences with such encounters. "Look, can we just move this along?" called out a voice from the line. "Some of us have flights to catch." Karen's head snapped toward the complaint, her authority challenged. "Security is my responsibility here," she shot back. "I'll take as long as necessary to ensure everyone's safety." She turned back to Judge Preston, her demeanor hardening further. "I'm going to need to search your bags. All of them." Judge Preston nodded slowly, his compliance absolute despite the growing inappropriateness of the situation. "Of course, Whatever you need to do." His calm response seemed to irritate Karen further, as if his dignity in the face of her hostility represented some form of defiance. She grabbed his briefcase with unnecessary force, the leather handle creaking under her grip. The sound of the latches opening echoed through the checkpoint area, drawing more attention to the scene. Inside the briefcase lay the carefully organized materials of a distinguished legal career: case briefs bound in blue folders, constitutional law texts with countless bookmarks protruding from their pages, and a thick stack of documents marked with the seal of the United States courts. Karen rifled through these materials with the subtlety of a hurricane, papers scattering as she searched for whatever imaginary contraband had captured her suspicion. "What's all this legal stuff?" she demanded, holding up a document without bothering to read its contents. "You some kind of lawyer or something?" "I work in the legal profession, yes," Judge Preston replied evenly, watching as his meticulously organized case files were reduced to chaos. Karen's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Right. And I'm the Queen of England." She continued her destructive search, tossing documents aside with increasing carelessness. "These papers look fake to me. How do I know you didn't just print these up at home?" The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Around them, the atmosphere had shifted from mere inconvenience to something darker, something that made fellow travelers uncomfortable in ways they couldn't quite articulate. Several people had begun recording with their phones, sensing that they were witnessing something that needed to be documented. Among the crowd, Dr. Sarah Chen, a civil rights attorney flying to Denver for a conference, recognized the familiar pattern unfolding before her. She had her phone out, recording discreetly while her legal mind cataloged every violation of procedure she was witnessing. Beside her, Marcus Williams, a journalist for the Washington Post, was also filming, his reporter's instincts telling him this story was bigger than a simple security delay. Karen had now moved to Judge Preston's personal bag, dumping its contents onto the metal examination table with deliberate roughness. His reading glasses clattered against the surface, followed by prescription medications, a worn leather wallet, and a small framed photograph of his late wife, Margaret, who had passed away 3 years earlier. The glass cracked as it hit the table, and for the first time, Judge Preston's composure flickered almost imperceptibly. "Careful with that, please," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of pain that Karen either didn't notice or chose to ignore. "Don't tell me how to do my job," she snapped, picking up the photograph and examining it as if it might contain hidden weapons. "Who's this supposed to be your wife? How do I know you didn't steal this from somebody else?" The cruelty of the comment sent ripples of shock through the gathered crowd. Even among the TSA agents working other security lanes, heads were turning, supervisors beginning to take notice of the escalating situation. But Karen seemed oblivious to the growing tension, lost in her performance of authority. She picked up Judge Preston's wallet, flipping it open to examine its contents. Credit cards scattered across the table as she searched through compartments, pulling out membership cards, business cards, and finally, a small, laminated card that made her pause. "What's this?" she demanded, holding up the card that identified Judge Preston as a member of the Colorado Bar Association with 40 years of service recognition. "My Bar Association membership," he replied calmly. Karen stared at the card, her confidence wavering for just a moment before reasserting itself. "Anyone can fake these things. You probably ordered it online." She tossed the card aside dismissively. "I'm going to need backup for this. We're looking at potential identity fraud here." She reached for her radio, her voice broadcasting across the security area with theatrical authority. "This is Whitmore at Checkpoint 3. I need additional officers for a possible fraud investigation. Subject is refusing to cooperate with standard security procedures. Judge Preston remained silent, allowing the lie to hang in the air without protest. He had learned long ago that certain battles required patience, that the truth had its own timing and its own power. Around him, the crowd of witnesses was growing, phones capturing every moment of what was becoming a spectacle of institutional prejudice. Dr. Chen stepped forward slightly, her legal training overriding her instinct to remain silent. "Excuse me, officer, but I'm an attorney, and I have to ask what specific security concern justifies this level of scrutiny. This gentleman has been completely cooperative." Karen whirled around, her authority challenged from an unexpected direction. "Ma'am, I need you to step back and mind your own business. This is a security matter." "Security matters are everyone's business when they're conducted in public," Dr. Chen replied firmly. "And what I'm witnessing appears to be harassment, not security screening." The word harassment hit Karen like a physical blow. "How dare you? I'm doing my job. Protecting this airport from potential threats? If you don't back off right now, I'll have you detained too." The threat only emboldened Dr. Chen, who recognized the legal implications of what she was witnessing. "I'd be happy to be detained if it means creating an official record of this encounter. Please call your supervisor." By now, 3 additional TSA agents had arrived, drawn by Karen's radio call and the growing commotion. Among them was Supervisor Janet Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran of airport security who took one look at the scene and immediately understood that something had gone terribly wrong. "What's the situation here?" "Whitmore," Supervisor Rodriguez asked, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who had dealt with Karen's overzealous behavior before. Karen launched into her explanation with renewed confidence, now playing to a larger audience. Subject presented suspicious identification, claims to be a lawyer, but his documentation appears fraudulent. I was conducting a thorough security screening when civilians began interfering with my investigation. Supervisor Rodriguez picked up Judge Preston's driver's license, examining it under the light. Unlike Karen's theatrical display, her inspection was professional and brief. The ID was clearly legitimate. The photograph unmistakably matched the man standing before her, and all security features were present and correct. "Sir, I apologize for this delay," she began, but Karen interrupted her. "Don't apologize. He's been uncooperative from the start. Claims he's some important lawyer. But look at him. Does he look like a lawyer to you?" The racist implication in Karen's words sent a visible shock through the crowd. Several passengers gasped audibly, while others shook their heads in disgust. The journalist, Marcus Williams, made sure his camera captured Karen's face as she spoke, knowing that her words would carry weight far beyond this airport terminal. Supervisor Rodriguez's face hardened. "That's enough. Whitmore, sir, again, I apologize. Your identification is perfectly valid, and you're free to proceed through security." But Karen wasn't finished. "No, I'm not done with my investigation. I have authority here, and I'm exercising it. This man is a security risk, and I'm detaining him for further questioning." She moved to block Judge Preston's path to the metal detectors, her body language aggressive and confrontational. "You're not going anywhere until I'm satisfied that you are who you claim to be." It was at this moment that the situation reached its critical tipping point. Judge Preston had remained silent through the harassment, the destruction of his belongings, and the racist implications. But now faced with unlawful detention, he felt compelled to act. "Officer Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying a new tone of authority that seemed to emerge from some deep well of judicial power. "I need you to understand something very clearly. You have no legal authority to detain me without probable cause, and nothing in my behavior or documentation provides such cause." Karen laughed mockingly. Oh, now you're going to lecture me on the law. What's next? Are you going to tell me you're a judge or something? The crowd fell silent. Even the ambient noise of the airport seemed to diminish, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Judge Preston looked directly into Karen's eyes, his gaze steady and penetrating. As a matter of fact, I am a judge. More specifically, I am Judge Harold Preston of the Colorado District Court, and I currently serve as the chairman of the National Judicial Ethics Committee. The words hit the gathered crowd like a thunderclap. Karen's face went white, then flushed red as the implications began to sink in. Around them, passengers began murmuring. The journalist's camera captured her shocked expression, and Supervisor Rodriguez closed her eyes, as if in physical pain. But Karen, in her panic and humiliation, doubled down on her position. I don't believe you. Anyone can claim to be a judge. Prove it. From the crowd, Dr. Chen stepped forward again, this time with her phone in hand and a look of recognition dawning on her face. Oh my God, it really is him. Judge Preston, I attended your lecture on civil rights law at Georgetown 2 years ago. Your Honor, I am so sorry this is happening to you. Marcus Williams, the journalist, was frantically typing on his phone, pulling up search results that confirmed Judge Preston's identity. He's right. Judge Harold Preston, appointed to the federal bench 15 years ago, currently chairs the Ethics Committee. This is going to be huge news. Other passengers began recognizing the name, some searching on their phones, others recalling news stories about Judge Preston's high-profile cases and his reputation for fairness and integrity. The murmur of the crowd grew louder as word spread through the security area that they were witnessing the harassment of one of the most respected judges in the country. Karen stood frozen, her authority crumbling around her like a house of cards in a windstorm. The realization of what she had done, and what it meant for her career, began to penetrate her consciousness. But instead of apologizing, instead of attempting to salvage the situation with grace, she chose to escalate further. I don't care who you claim to be, she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. You still have to follow security procedures like everyone else. Being a judge doesn't give you special privileges. Judge Preston nodded slowly, his demeanor remaining calm despite the chaos swirling around him. You're absolutely correct. Officer Whitmore, being a judge doesn't grant me special privileges, and I would never ask for any. But it also doesn't subject me to harassment, racial profiling, or unlawful detention. He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. What you've done here today isn't security screening. It's abuse of authority. And unfortunately for you, it's been witnessed by dozens of people and recorded by multiple cameras. Supervisor Rodriguez had been making urgent calls on her radio, and now airport security management was converging on the checkpoint. The area around Judge Preston had become the center of a storm that was rapidly growing beyond anyone's control. Your Honor, Supervisor Rodriguez said, her voice formal and apologetic. On behalf of the Transportation Security Administration, I offer my deepest apologies for this incident. Officer Whitmore's behavior is completely unacceptable and does not represent the values or procedures of our organization. Karen looked around desperately, realizing that her colleagues were distancing themselves from her actions. You're all overreacting. I was doing my job. How was I supposed to know he was really a judge? He could have said something earlier. Doctor, Chen stepped forward, her legal training taking over. He shouldn't have had to say anything. His identification was valid. His behavior was cooperative. And your treatment of him was discriminatory from the beginning. This is exactly the kind of profiling that creates hostile environments for travelers of color. The crowd was growing larger as news of the incident spread through social media. Passengers from other security lines were migrating to witness the spectacle, many recording with their phones as the story of the harassment began to take shape in real-time social media posts. Judge Preston, seeing the situation spiraling beyond any reasonable conclusion, decided to address the broader audience that had gathered. He stepped slightly forward, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent addressing courtrooms and juries. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank those of you who spoke up today. Your willingness to challenge injustice when you see it is what makes our democracy strong. His voice carried clearly through the terminal space, passengers falling silent to listen. What happened here today happens too often to too many people who don't have the privilege of recognition that eventually protected me. People who don't have cameras recording their experience. People who don't have credentials that others feel compelled to respect. He looked directly at Karen, who was now surrounded by supervisors and looking increasingly isolated. Officer Whitmore, I don't know what experiences or training led you to treat me as you did today, but I want you to understand something important. The authority you wield here is not yours to abuse. It's held in trust for the American people, and, when you misuse it, you damage not just your victims, but the very institutions we all depend on. Karen's face was now streaked with tears, the full weight of her situation finally penetrating her consciousness. I was just doing my job, she whispered. Her earlier bravado completely collapsed. No, Judge Preston replied firmly, but without cruelty. You were abusing your position. There's a difference, and it's a difference that will likely cost you dearly. Airport management had now arrived, led by Terminal Director Robert Hayes, whose face reflected the gravity of a situation that he knew would have ramifications far beyond the immediate incident. Your Honor, I cannot begin to express how sorry we are for this incident. Officer Whitmore will be immediately suspended pending a full investigation. Karen looked up sharply, reality hitting her like a physical blow. Suspended. You can't suspend me for doing my job. You weren't doing your job. Director Hayes replied firmly. You were engaged in racial profiling and harassment. This incident will be reported to federal authorities, and we will cooperate fully with any investigation that follows. The journalist, Marcus Williams, was already drafting his story, knowing that within hours this incident would be national news. The video footage would go viral. Karen's behavior would be dissected by legal experts, and the broader conversation about racial profiling in airports would once again dominate news cycles. Judge Preston began gathering his scattered belongings, carefully placing his damaged photograph of Margaret back in his bag. The cracked glass caught the fluorescent light, a physical reminder of the cruelty he had endured. Several passengers moved to help him, their small acts of kindness a counterpoint to the hatred he had faced. Your Honor, Dr. Chen approached him as he finished repacking his briefcase. I practice civil rights law. If you decide to pursue legal action over this incident, I would be honored to assist you. Judge Preston smiled, the first genuine smile he had shown since the ordeal began. Thank you. Dr. Chen, your courage in speaking up today meant more than you know. But I think the consequences Officer Whitmore will face through official channels will be sufficient. Sometimes the system works, even when individuals within it fail. As airport security began to restore normal operations, Judge Preston finally proceeded through the metal detector that he should have passed through an hour earlier. The simple beep of the machine seemed anticlimactic after the drama that had preceded it. On the other side, as he collected his belongings from the X-ray machine, several passengers approached him. An elderly white woman touched his arm gently. Judge Preston, I'm so sorry you had to go through that. My husband and we've seen things like this before, and we should have spoken up sooner. "Thank you," he replied warmly. "Your recognition of the problem is the first step toward solving it." A young black man, probably in his 20s, waited nervously to speak with him. "Sir, Your Honor, I just thank you for how you handled that, for showing us how to keep our dignity, even when people try to take it away." Judge Preston placed a fatherly hand on the young man's shoulder. "Son, dignity isn't something that can be taken from you. It can only be surrendered. Never surrender yours." As he walked toward his gate, Judge Preston could hear behind him the continued commotion as Karen was formally removed from her position and escorted from the security area. Her career in airport security was over, ended by her own prejudice and abuse of authority. The incident was already spreading across social media platforms. Airport justice began trending as videos of the confrontation were shared thousands of times. News outlets were picking up the story. Legal experts were being interviewed about racial profiling in transportation security, and the Transportation Security Administration was preparing for a public relations crisis. Judge Preston's flight to Washington was delayed, giving him time to reflect on the morning's events as he sat in the departure lounge. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters, colleagues, and civil rights organizations. But he let them go to voicemail. He needed time to process what had happened, to consider its implications not just for him personally, but for the broader issues of justice and equality that had defined his career. When his flight finally boarded, fellow passengers recognized him and offered words of support. The flight attendants, having heard about the incident, treated him with extra courtesy, though he would have preferred to fade into anonymity. The young man who had spoken to him at security was on the same flight, and Judge Preston was touched to see how the incident had affected someone barely starting his adult life. During the flight, Judge Preston worked on his keynote address for the Ethics Committee meeting, finding that the morning's events had given him new material and new urgency for his message about equality in the justice system. What had started as an academic discussion of legal principles had become a personal testimony about the persistent reality of prejudice in American institutions. Meanwhile, back at Denver International Airport, the reverberations of the incident continued to spread. Karen Whitmore was formally terminated from her position, her actions deemed a clear violation of TSA protocols and civil rights guidelines. The incident would follow her for the rest of her career, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and personal prejudice. The airport implemented immediate retraining programs for all security personnel, focusing on respectful treatment of passengers and recognition of implicit bias. The incident became a case study in security training programs across the country, a stark example of how individual prejudice could damage institutional credibility. When Judge Preston arrived in Washington, he was met by colleagues from the Ethics Committee who had seen the news coverage. Their support was immediate and unqualified, but he could see in their eyes the recognition that what had happened to him could happen to any of them, regardless of their professional achievements or social standing. His keynote address the next day was delivered to a packed auditorium, with attendance swelled by legal professionals who had heard about the airport incident. He spoke about the gap between legal ideals and lived reality, about the responsibility of those in positions of authority to examine their own biases and behaviors. Yesterday morning, I experienced firsthand the kind of treatment that millions of Americans face regularly, he told the assembled judges and legal professionals. I was fortunate that my credentials eventually protected me. But we must ask ourselves, what about those who don't have such protection? What about the citizens who depend on us to ensure that justice is truly blind, not selectively cited? The speech was recorded and later posted online, where it was viewed millions of times. Legal scholars praised its eloquence and honesty, while civil rights activists used it as a rallying cry for continued reform of law enforcement and security practices. In the weeks that followed, Judge Preston received hundreds of letters from people sharing their own experiences with discrimination and profiling. Many thanked him for his dignified response to Karen's harassment, saying that his example had given them hope that change was possible. The incident also sparked broader conversations about training and accountability in security agencies. Congress held hearings on racial profiling in transportation security. With Judge Preston's experience serving as a centerpiece of the testimony, reforms were implemented, policies were changed, and the incident became a turning point in how security screening was conducted across the country. Karen Whitmore, meanwhile, found herself unemployable in security work and became a symbol of the consequences of discrimination. She eventually left Colorado, trying to rebuild her life away from the notoriety her actions had brought her. The incident served as a stark reminder that in the age of social media and ubiquitous recording devices, abuse of authority could have swift and lasting consequences. For Judge Preston, the incident became a defining moment in a career already dedicated to justice and equality. He continued to serve on the Ethics Committee with renewed passion, using his experience to advocate for reforms that would protect others from similar treatment. The cracked photograph of his wife Margaret remained in his briefcase, a reminder of the personal cost of prejudice, but also of the strength that comes from enduring injustice with dignity. He often thought about what Margaret would have said about the incident, knowing she would have been proud of how he handled himself under pressure. Years later, the Denver International Airport incident was still cited in training programs and legal textbooks as an example of how individual prejudice could cascade into institutional crisis. Judge Preston's response became a model for how to confront discrimination with courage and dignity, transforming a moment of personal humiliation into a catalyst for broader social change. The terminal where it all happened was eventually renamed in honor of civil rights leaders, a permanent reminder that the struggle for equality requires constant vigilance and the courage to speak truth to power, even in the most unlikely of circumstances. In the end, Karen Whitmore's attempt to diminish Judge Preston's dignity had instead elevated it, transforming a routine airport security checkpoint into a courtroom where justice, delayed but not denied, ultimately prevailed. The fluorescent lights that had hummed overhead during that tense confrontation continued to shine, but now they illuminated a changed landscape where prejudice faced swifter consequences and dignity commanded greater respect. The story spread far beyond the confines of Denver International Airport, becoming a parable about power, prejudice, and the unexpected moments when justice reveals itself in the most ordinary of places. And somewhere in that sprawling terminal, future travelers would pass through security checkpoints where officers had been trained never to forget the lesson of Judge Harold Preston and the TSA agent who thought she could judge a man by his appearance rather than his character.